Do you know that strange feeling of somehow being treated unfairly, but you can't quite put your finger on why? That's exactly what today's topic is about. Everyday discrimination here in Germany, often subtle and invisible. And we'll look at it using facts, based on a large study that examined exactly these kinds of experiences. Just imagine this situation. A woman applies for a job. On the phone everything sounds great. They are enthusiastic about her and ask her to quickly send her documents. She does, including a photo where she is wearing a headscarf. And then, just 2 days later, the rejection arrives. The position is suddenly already filled. By the way, this is not a fictional story. It is a real experience documented in the study. And it raises a question. Have you ever experienced something like this yourself, or seen it happen around you? That strange gut feeling, an explanation that somehow doesn't quite add up? And that is exactly where we need to start. Because these experiences are not unfortunate isolated cases. Let's take a closer look at how common and how systematic these moments of injustice actually are. The story of the woman with the headscarf is not just a small personal anecdote. It is one piece of a much bigger puzzle, and to understand the whole picture, we now need to move from individual stories to the data. Now it becomes more concrete. Let's put the personal stories aside for a moment and look at the hard numbers. Only they show us the real scale of the problem. So where does discrimination happen most often? The data here speak very clearly. At the top of the list, the workplace. Job searches, offices, promotions. Closely followed by the housing market. We all know how difficult that can be. And then everyday public life, shopping, public transport, dealing with authorities. These are not marginal spaces. This is the core of everyday life. And why are people treated unfairly? What are the reasons? According to the study, the most common factors are ethnic background, gender, or age. But disability or socioeconomic status, whether someone is perceived as poor or wealthy, also play a major role. Look at this number, 58.3%. That is more than half. And this is the crucial point. This number represents all the people who did nothing after such an experience. Not because they didn't care, but because of resignation. Because of that paralyzing feeling, it won't change anything anyway. In a way, it is a silent surrender to injustice. And that leads to an important question. If the numbers are so clear, why do many of us barely notice discrimination in everyday life? Why is it so often overlooked or dismissed as, that wasn't meant that way? A large part of the answer lies in our own minds. Let's take a look at the psychological mechanisms that sometimes make us almost blind to injustice. It starts with stereotypes. Our brains love efficiency. They use shortcuts to organize the world. Stereotypes are exactly that. Simple templates for complex groups of people. They help us make quick judgments, but they are dangerous because they distort reality. The study explains this well with something called prototype theory. Think about the word bird. What comes to mind first? For most people it's something like a sparrow or a blackbird, small, chirping, flying. That's our prototype. Hardly anyone thinks of a penguin first, even though it is also a bird. It just doesn't fit our mental standard image. Exactly the same thing happens with discrimination. We recognize it most easily when it fits our prototype of injustice, when it is loud, obvious, aggressive. But subtle discrimination, like the job rejection at the beginning, often doesn't fit this image. And because of that, our brains hesitate to call it what it actually is: discrimination. But it's not only about psychology. Sometimes discrimination is not the result of bad intentions by a single person. Sometimes it is embedded much deeper, in systems, rules, and laws. This is not about finding someone to blame. It is about systems that were designed for a certain, standard person. Think of tax forms where the husband is still treated as the default. Or public transport that is not accessible for people with disabilities. Or laws that completely ignore the diversity of gender identities. What this means in everyday life is illustrated by this quote. For most of us, a loudspeaker announcement is simply information. But for a deaf person it is just a frightening sound that excludes them. Here a system that was not designed for everyone creates new barriers every day. So we have now looked at the problem from different angles. But of course we don't want to stop there. The study also offers concrete ideas for solutions. The recommendations are clear, and importantly, they are practical. Laws need to be improved so that no one falls through the cracks. There should be more transparency, for example in salaries, to make inequality visible. Training is needed so people can recognize their own biases. And very importantly, there must be strong, well-funded counseling services for anyone seeking help. In the end, perhaps the most important point is this: we can only fight what we are able to see and understand. Awareness of the patterns, the numbers, and also the stories behind them is the first and most important step toward real change. And finally, I would like to leave you with one question. After hearing all this, what does equal treatment actually mean to you? In your everyday life, personally, think about it. Today we discussed a study by the German Federal Anti-Discrimination Agency from 2017.